It feels like everywhere you turn these days, AI is popping up, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
Making decisions that, affect all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, obviously comes a ton of questions about, how these AI systems actually work and, what happens when things go wrong.
Right.
And who's really responsible.
Absolutely, yeah.
So trying to keep up with it all can get a little overwhelming, to say the least.
It really can. And that's really where this whole idea of AI ethics auditing is starting to gain some serious traction.
Right.
I mean, think about it. It's kind of a way to peek under the hood and see what's really going on, right?
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to be diving into today, this whole emerging field of AI ethics auditing.
Okay, cool.
We've got some really interesting research to work with here. A 2024 study titled The Emergence of Artificial Intelligence Ethics Auditing.
Okay. So this is like our cheat sheet.
Exactly. A shortcut to understanding what's actually happening in AI ethics auditing right now.
Okay, I like it. A shortcut? All right, so we've got this study. We're diving in. Let's unpack it. What's the big motivator for all of this? Why are companies even thinking about AI audits?
Well, that's what I found really interesting here.
Yeah.
The primary driver doesn't seem to be like this sudden surge of wanting to do good.
Okay.
It's actually the anticipation of regulation.
So it's the stick, not the carrot.
It seems that way, yeah. Both internal and external auditing are being increasingly encouraged.
Okay.
And the auditors in this study were very clear that's the main push.
So it's about compliance then, not necessarily a change of heart.
That seems to be the case for many, yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So we're talking regulation. What specifically are these companies worried about?
Well, when it comes to regulation, there's one big one everyone's talking about, the EU AI Act.
Right.
It's seen as a major player, internationally, and potentially it could set a global standard that everyone else follows.
So like a model for everyone else.
Exactly. And the auditors are reading about here, they're all watching it very closely, no matter where they are in the world.
Right. So this EU AI Act, the one to watch.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. But it wasn't just the EU, right? This study mentioned other regulations and frameworks too.
Oh, absolutely. There was a whole mix. At the international level, there were the European Commission's guidelines for trustworthy AI.
Right.
But then nationally, you've got the UK Algorithmic Transparency Standard, the US NIST AI Risk Management Framework, and even zooming in further at a more local level, New York City's Local Law 144 popped up. That one's all about those automated tools for hiring decisions.
Right.
And even some sector-specific things like SR 117 in the US, which is all about model risk management within finance.
So this sounds like it's kind of a patchwork of rules right now, but, it's growing.
It is. It's fragmented, but definitely growing, yeah.
Okay, so regulation is number one. What's the second biggest driver for these audits?
That would be reputational risk.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Companies are realizing that, problems with their AI can be a PR nightmare.
Absolutely. Like all it takes is one bad headline.
Exactly. And it goes deeper than just bad press.
Oh, sure.
Auditors pointed out that it affects everything. Customer trust, employee trust, even how well their AI models actually perform.
Right, because if people don't trust your AI, they're not going to use it.
Right, exactly. If your AI is seen as shady or unreliable, people just aren't going to buy into it.
Yeah. Makes sense. But what about public pressure? I would thought, people getting upset, protesting, that kind of thing would be a bigger factor.
It's interesting. At the time of this study, that wasn't seen as a major driver.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, public awareness is definitely growing, but it hadn't really translated into a big push for audits.
Huh. Okay. What about investors then? Are they putting pressure on companies to get these audits done?
Again, not so much at that time. I mean, investors and boards, they're increasingly into ESG, environmental, social governance,
Right.
But AI auditing specifically wasn't really on their radar yet.
Interesting. So it's more about the looming regulations than anything else.
It seems so, yeah. Although the study did mention one other interesting driver.
Okay, what's that?
The role of individuals.
Individuals?
Yeah, like specific personalities within a company. Often senior leaders, like a CEO who are really passionate about AI oversight.
Oh, so like a top-down approach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can be a huge catalyst. Even if there's not a ton of external pressure, you get the right person at the top and things start happening.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got a good sense of what's pushing companies towards these audits. Now let's talk about what actually happens during one. What's the process like?
Well, The study found that there are some really strong parallels with financial audits.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they often follow those same basic stages, planning, performing, and reporting.
Okay. So familiar territory for a lot of companies then.
Exactly. It's a framework they already understand, even if AI is still new.
Okay. So let's break it down. What does planning for an AI audit involve?
So in the planning stage, you're figuring out the scope of the audit. And this is where things get really interesting because there's a ton of variation
Okay.
and a lot of back and forth between the auditors and the client.
So it's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Definitely not. You've
Okay.
got everything from broad governance audits to much more focused algorithmic audits.
Okay, what's the difference?
So a governance audit that's looking at the big picture, right?
Okay.
All the AI systems in an organization, how they're developed, a whole organizational structure. Algorithmic audits, they're zooming in on one specific system
Okay.
or algorithm, looking at its data, how well it performs, what the outcomes are.
Gotcha. So one's the 30,000-foot view, the other is down in the weeds.
Yeah, perfect analogy.
The study also mentioned something about sauce providers.
Right. So as this whole AI field explodes, we're seeing all these software as a service companies popping up, offering tools to help with these audits, things like assessing data privacy, explainability of the models, that kind of thing. And auditors are using these tools more and more during planning.
So they're like helping them get a handle on the technical stuff.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, who's involved in this planning phase? Who are they talking to?
Well, what they found was it tends to be a pretty narrow group. You've got your technical teams, obviously, data scientists, ML engineers, that kind of crew.
Right.
But then also people from risk and compliance, legal, especially in places like finance where there's tons of regulation already. And you'll get some business and product leads in the mix too.
Okay. So it makes sense, but it sounds a little internal.
Yeah. And that's actually one of the potential gaps that the study highlighted.
Oh.
Compared to what a lot of people recommend, there isn't a whole lot of engagement with the wider public or groups that might be specifically affected by the AI.
Right.
Or even shareholders for that matter. So there's this question of, whose voices are being heard.
Right. Whose perspective is missing from the conversation?
Exactly.
Okay, so planning is done. They've figured out the scope, talked to the key people. What happens next? What does performing an AI audit actually involve?
So the study identified two main activities: risk management and model validation.
Okay. So starting with risk management, what does that look like?
Well, it's heavily focused on identifying potential risks. Could be operational, legal, reputational, you name it. They often use things like scorecards and questionnaires.
Okay. So like a checklist?
Pretty much. But here's the thing. They found less emphasis on actually figuring out how serious those risks are or how to fix them.
Really? So they're finding the problems, but not necessarily solving them.
Yeah. At this stage, it's more about spotting potential issues, not fully addressing them yet.
Okay. Interesting. And then the other big activity is model validation.
Right. This is where they really dive deep into how a specific AI model works.
Okay.
They're looking at everything.
Oh.
The design, how the data was collected. They test for things like bias, making sure the model isn't treating different groups unfairly.
Right.
And they look at how easy it is to understand the model's decisions. Can a human actually make sense of what it's doing? And they also check for something called data drift.
Data drift.
Yeah. Basically, whether the model's performance might change over time. Because the data it's using keeps changing,
Right. So it's not a static thing.
Exactly. And get this, the study even found cases where auditors were building their own models.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, as part of this validation process.
Okay, so they're really getting their hands dirty here.
Yeah, they are.
What were some of the big takeaways from this whole performing the audit stage? What did they learn?
Well, one thing that kept coming up was how important it is for the client to be willing to share their model and data.
Oh, right, because otherwise the auditors are working in the dark.
Exactly. And that ties into good data management,
Yeah.
Having things organized so you can actually share that information.
Right. Makes sense. What else?
Well, sometimes the model validation was part of a bigger analysis, looking at the whole context, where the AI is actually being used.
Okay.
But often it was more narrowly focused, just looking at what the model spits out.
Okay. So kind of depends on the audit.
It does, yeah. And of course, whatever regulations are in play have a huge impact too.
Right. Because the auditors are going to focus on whatever the regulators are going to be looking for.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah, totally. The study also mentioned something about post-deployment monitoring.
Oh, that's a big one.
Okay.
People are realizing that these AI models, they don't just stay the same.
Yeah, they evolve.
They do. And that means their performance can change, the effects they have can change after they're already out there in the world.
Right. So you can't just audit once and call it a day.
Nope. So there's a big push now for continuous monitoring, using dashboards, alerts, tracking all sorts of metrics. But here's the tricky part. How do you set those thresholds, right?
Right. Like, what's an acceptable level of bias or change in performance?
Exactly. And because AI is changing so fast, what's acceptable this year might be totally different next year.
Right. So how do you even keep up?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. It's like trying to hit a moving target.
Okay, so we've got planning, we've got performing. Now we're at the reporting stage.
Mm-hmm.
How do they actually communicate what they've found?
Well, this is where things get a little less clear-cut,
Right.
especially compared to, financial audits.
In what way?
Well, when it comes to measuring success, there often aren't specific metrics.
Really? So how do they know if they've actually done a good job?
Some auditors pointed to things like improvements in those OKRs or KPIs, the company's objectives and performance indicators,
Okay.
especially around reducing bias, improving accuracy, even things like profit sometimes.
So concrete improvements you can actually see.
Right. But a lot of them admitted they didn't have those clear-cut metrics.
So what were they looking at then?
Things like, did they finish the report?
Okay.
Did they deliver what they promised? Did they see improvements in the organization's awareness or their capacity to manage AI?
So more about the process and the impact on the organization.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, that's what they focused on.
Interesting. What about the reports themselves? Who gets to see those?
So technical reports are the standard,
Okay.
and often these external auditors have their own templates they use, but those reports are pretty much always just for internal audiences.
So kept within the company.
Yeah. Public reporting is rare.
Really?
Yeah.
That's different from financial audits where a lot of that information is public.
Huge difference. The study did mention this idea of maybe adapting internal reports, for public consumption.
Okay.
Or as a sweetener for regulators, but that wasn't common practice at all.
Huh. Interesting. Okay. So to summarize, this whole process generally follows the financial audit model, right? Planning, performing, reporting.
Yeah, it does.
But there's a lot of variation. And that reporting stage, it's still kind of a work in progress.
That's a fair assessment, yeah. The framework's there, but there's definitely still room for growth as the whole field matures.
Okay. That makes sense. So doing these AI audits, it sounds pretty complicated. What are some of the biggest challenges they're running into?
Well, the top one by far was just all the uncertainty. Everything's so new, the regulations are still being figured out, there's no real set of best practices yet.
So they're kind of making it up as they go along.
In a lot of ways, yeah. And that can be really tough, especially when the clients are looking to them for answers.
Right, like they're the experts, but even they're not totally sure what the rules are yet.
Exactly. It's like trying to build a house with an incomplete blueprint.
That's a great analogy.
And because of that, a lot of companies aren't really investing in this stuff yet.
Right. Makes sense. If you don't know what the rules are,
Yeah.
why spend a ton of money on it?
Exactly. Another big challenge is the lack of standardized tests.
For the AI.
Yeah. Like, how do you measure bias? How do you compare different systems? There's not a lot of agreement on those things yet.
Makes sense. If you can't measure it, how do you know if you're making progress?
Right. And then there's this concern about focusing too much on the technical stuff.
Okay.
Like, you can't just code your way out of every problem.
Yeah. AI exists in the real world. It's going to have real world effects.
Exactly. What other practical challenges were there?
Oh, accessing data and documentation was a huge one.
Oh, right. Because if you can't even see the data, how can you audit it?
Exactly. And a lot of organizations, their data management isn't great.
Like, they don't even know where their data is coming from.
Sometimes, yeah.
Right.
Or how it's being used. And auditors were spending tons of time just trying to get clients to, do basic documentation.
It sounds like a lot of companies aren't really ready for these audits.
That was a big takeaway, yeah. They just don't have the systems in place.
Huh.
The whole management structure around AI is still developing.
Okay. So a lot of challenges, but this study also talked about some key themes emerging in this whole AI auditing world. What stood out to you?
Well, there's this interesting tension between ambiguity and progress.
Mm-hmm. On the one hand, there's a lot of uncertainty, like what even counts as a real audit?
Right.
There are questions about independence, especially since some auditors also do consulting. And the whole ecosystem is so new, regulations are still emerging. There's no real standardization, no accreditation process.
Man, sounds like the Wild West out there.
It kind of is. But on the other hand, there's a lot of progress happening too. Like auditors are actively referencing all these different regulations, standards, frameworks.
Okay.
And there's some convergence happening, especially around the EU AI Act and the NIST framework in the US. And they're actually making a difference, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Putting regulations into practice, making models fairer, getting organizations to think more broadly about their AI. They're even pushing for organizational change.
Like how so?
Improving data infrastructure, getting different teams to work together. It's exciting to see.
So messy, but moving forward.
Exactly. And the parallel with how financial auditing developed is really helpful here, you know? That took time too.
Right. It wasn't an overnight thing.
Nope.
Okay. So what about those gaps we talked about?
Oh, right.
Measuring success, reporting, stakeholder engagement. Are those still major issues?
They are, yeah. The study really emphasized that those areas need a lot more work.
Okay.
Like, how do we measure success when it comes to AI ethics? What are the criteria?
Right.
Public reporting is still pretty much non-existent.
All right.
And engaging with a broader set of stakeholders beyond just the technical people and the management, that's still way behind where it should be.
Why do you think that is? Why isn't there more stakeholder engagement?
Well, the study suggests a few reasons. It could be resources, you know. Auditing firms and clients might not have the capacity to do it, or the focus on regulatory compliance might be taking up all their time and energy.
Okay.
And then there's the lack of best practices. Like, how do you actually do stakeholder engagement well in this context?
Right.
And then there's also the fear of risk.
Risk.
Yeah. Like, what if wider disclosure leads to problems? What if they're worried about revealing trade secrets?
Right. That makes sense.
So there are a lot of barriers to overcome.
Okay. So final big takeaway from the study, the role of AI auditors in shaping how AI is managed.
Yeah. That was a really interesting point. So even though these audits don't always meet those traditional criteria for auditing, you know, independence, open reporting.
Right.
Auditors are playing this crucial role. It's like a transition phase. They're figuring it out as they go.
So they're kind of pioneers.
Yeah, exactly. They're on the front lines interpreting these vague regulations, putting those frameworks into practice.
Right.
And they're working with organizations that often don't have the expertise in-house. They're having to create a lot of this stuff from scratch.
So framework, tools, reports.
Yeah, the whole shebang. They're like the interpreters, the translators in this whole new world.
It's like they're building the plane as they're flying it.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot.
We have.
What are the key takeaways for our listener?
I think the biggest one is that this whole field of AI auditing, it's being driven by two main things: regulation and reputation.
Okay.
And while it often looks a lot like financial auditing, with the planning, performing, reporting stages, there's still a ton of variation.
Right.
And it's facing some major challenges, especially because the regulatory landscape is still so new. But even with all that, these auditors are making real progress.
Yeah.
But there are still some big gaps, especially when it comes to measuring success, reporting what they find, and involving more people in the process.
Okay.
But ultimately, these auditors are shaping the future of how we manage AI, even if the path forward isn't always clear.
It's a work in progress, but a really important one.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our final thought for our listener. Given where things are right now, with all this ambiguity, what's our responsibility as individuals?
Okay.
To understand how these AI systems are being overseen,
Right.
and to start asking questions about that oversight.
Because ultimately, these systems affect all of us, right?
Yeah, they do. So we need to be informed. We need to be engaged.
Absolutely. This has been a fascinating deep dive. Thanks so much for breaking it all down for us.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep thinking about these issues. Maybe even do some more research on those specific regulations and frameworks that piqued your interest.
Yeah, great idea.
Because understanding these things, that's how we start to navigate this whole complex world of AI.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
See you next time.